Mexico, a rule that every cartel boss knows, every hitman understands, and every trafficker operating between Tijuana and Cancun has burned into their mind like a scar. You do not touch Americans. You do not kidnap them, you do not shoot them, you do not make them disappear, because if you do, the full weight of the most powerful military machine on earth comes down on you personally. And right now, under Donald Trump, that rule has never felt more real. Think about what has happened in just the last few weeks. Ruben Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, one of the most feared and powerful cartel bosses in modern Mexican history, the man who built the Jalisco New Generation Cartel into a criminal empire that stretched across continents, is dead, gone, eliminated, and the White House didn't just acknowledge it quietly. Caroline Leavitt went on national television and sent a message directly to every cartel operating in Mexico. The Mexican cartels know they are not to touch a single American, or there will be severe consequences under this presidency. That wasn't a diplomatic statement. That was a warning delivered in plain language on morning television to criminal organizations that have been watching every move coming out of Washington with extreme attention. And according to security experts, analysts, and former American federal officials, the cartels heard it loud and clear. Then, to understand why this moment is so significant, you need to understand how cartels actually think. Because the popular image of cartel leadership, impulsive, violent, operating purely on ego and brutality, is fundamentally wrong. The men who run these organizations are calculating. They are strategic. They have lawyers, intelligence networks, political contacts, and analysts whose entire job is to monitor the American political landscape and assess the level of risk coming from Washington at any given moment. Elena Chavez, a cartel expert and activist who has spent years studying these organizations from the inside out, put it plainly. The cartels, she said, have modernized. They are well informed. They know when bounties are placed on their leaders' heads. They know when the political climate in the United States shifts. They track it, they analyze it, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. They fear the United States, she said, even more so since Trump came to power and declared the cartels terrorist organizations. That designation, foreign terrorist organization, changed everything. It wasn't just symbolic. It opened doors to legal tools, financial sanctions, intelligence sharing mechanisms, and military options that simply didn't exist before. And the cartels know exactly what it means for them operationally. But here's what makes this story so layered, so much deeper than a simple political win for the Trump administration. The reason cartels avoid targeting Americans isn't new. It didn't start with Trump. It is rooted in decades of painful, bloody lessons that these organizations learned the hard way through catastrophic mistakes that brought the full force of American law enforcement crashing down on them. The case that changed everything happened in 1985. Enrique Kiki Camarena was a DEA agent working undercover in Mexico, embedded deep inside the Guadalajara cartel's operations. When cartel leaders Rafael Caro Quintero, Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo discovered who he was, they made a decision that would define cartel strategy for the next 40 years. They kidnapped him, they tortured him, and they killed him. What happened next was a masterclass in how America responds when one of its own is taken. The DEA launched Operation Leyenda, one of the most aggressive international law enforcement operations in American history. The entire Guadalajara cartel was dismantled. Its leaders were hunted down across borders. The political fallout reshaped the entire relationship between the United States and Mexico on drug enforcement, and every cartel that came after, every organization that built itself on the ruins of Guadalajara, absorbed that lesson into its DNA. You kill an American agent, you don't just lose a battle, you lose everything. Fast forward to 2011. ICE Special Agent Jaime Zapata is driving on a highway in San Luis Potosi when armed members of the Zetas cartel open fire on his vehicle. Zapata is killed. His partner Victor Avila is shot and survives. The response from Washington is immediate and overwhelming. Massive pressure on Mexico. Arrests across the Zetas network. The cartel member who pulled the trigger, Julian Zapata Espinoza, nicknamed El Piolín, is captured and prosecuted. Once again, the message is delivered in the only language cartels truly understand. Touch an American, and you will be found. You will be caught. and your organization will suffer consequences that no amount of drug money can protect you from. Samuel Gonzalez, a national security expert and former prosecutor who spent years inside Mexico's special anti-organized crime unit, explains the calculus with striking clarity. There is a tacit rule: you do not touch American citizens. Doing so triggers retaliation, and that is even more true today with the Trump administration. More than 1 million Americans visit Mexico every year for vacation. They walk through resorts in Cabo, party in Puerto Vallarta, explore ruins in the Yucatan, and the overwhelming majority of them return home without incident, not because Mexico is uniformly safe, but because the cartels have made a deliberate, strategic, profit-driven decision to leave them alone. Now factor in what Trump has added on top of this already existing dynamic, because what the current administration has done is take that underlying fear and amplify it to levels that previous administrations, Republican or Democrat, never reached. The designation of cartels as foreign terrorist organizations wasn't just paperwork, it was a signal. It meant that the tools used to dismantle ISIS, to pursue al-Qaeda, to go after state-sponsored terror networks, could now theoretically be turned toward criminal organizations operating out of Mexico and Central America, drone strikes, special operations, targeted eliminations on foreign soil, and Trump didn't leave that implication subtle. He made it explicit. At the brand new Shield of the Americas summit in Florida, a coalition of 12 Latin American and Caribbean nations assembled specifically to coordinate the fight against cartels, Trump stood in front of heads of state from Argentina, El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, Costa Rica, Bolivia, Chile, and Guyana, and delivered a message with zero diplomatic softening. We have to wipe them out, because they're getting worse. They're taking over their country. The cartels run Mexico. You can't let that happen. It's too close to us. That summit, the Shield of the Americas, is itself a story worth understanding, because it represents something that hasn't happened before in this form. 12 nations, sitting in the same room, agreeing to coordinate against criminal organizations that have historically benefited from the fragmentation of regional law enforcement. Cartels have thrived precisely because they operate across borders, while the authorities chasing them are constrained by those same borders. A multilateral coalition changes that geometry in ways that are genuinely threatening to how these organizations function. But there is another dimension to this story that the political headlines consistently miss, and it is one that Francisco Rivas, Director General of Mexico's National Citizens Observatory, articulates with a precision that reframes the entire conversation. The violence in Mexico is real. The cartels are brutal. The homicide rates in certain regions are among the highest on Earth. But the violence is not random. It is not indiscriminate. It is, in its own twisted, horrifying logic, targeted. More than 90% of homicides and forced disappearances in Mexico involve people who had contact with the cartels, primarily for commercial reasons, Rivas explains. The problems that tourists encounter in Mexico are similar to those they might encounter in Miami, London, Rome, or Paris: theft, scams, and even some extortion. But these remain proportionally marginal. What this means in practical terms is that the Mexico most tourists experience and the Mexico that cartel violence actually inhabits are two largely parallel worlds. They exist in the same geography, sometimes in the same cities, occasionally in terrifyingly close proximity. As the burning storefronts in Puerto Vallarta after El Mencho's death made viscerally clear. But the cartels are not running a war against tourists. They are running a war against each other, against rivals, against informants, against people who owe them money or cross them in business. The tourist is largely invisible to that war, by deliberate cartel policy. What has changed under Trump, and what makes this moment genuinely different from anything that came before, is the speed and visibility of consequences. Previous administrations talked tough on cartels. They made designations, issued statements, launched operations. But the gap between rhetoric and action was always wide enough for cartel leadership to feel a certain degree of insulation. That gap has closed. El Mencho is dead. Nicolas Maduro was captured. The Ayatollah Khamenei was killed in Iran. These are not events that cartel bosses are reading about in the newspaper with detached interest. These are data points they are feeding into their risk models and their survival calculations. And the conclusion those calculations are producing is the same one Elena Chavez described. They fear the United States, more than before, more than under any recent administration. Former DEA acting administrator Derek Maltz framed it directly when discussing Trump's promise to use lethal military force against cartels and narco-terrorists. The credibility of that threat, the belief that it is not just rhetoric but actual policy, is itself a tool. Deterrence works when the threatened party believes the consequences are real. And right now, the cartels believe. This does not mean the threat is gone. It does not mean that Americans in Mexico face zero risk. The violence in Jalisco, Sinaloa, Michoacan, and a dozen other cartel-contested states remains staggering in scale. The war between the CJNG and the Sinaloa cartel, already destabilized by the death of El Mencho and the fractures inside Sinaloa's own leadership, is entering a new and potentially more chaotic phase. When power vacuums open at the top of these organizations, the violence that follows is often less strategic, less controlled, and more likely to spill beyond its usual boundaries. That is the moment where the unwritten rule becomes hardest to enforce. Not when a cartel is at its strongest and most disciplined, but when it is fragmenting, when mid-level commanders are fighting for succession, when the internal controls that normally keep violence targeted and strategic start to break down. And that is exactly why the Shield of the Americas Summit, the Foreign Terrorist Organization designations, the visible willingness to pursue cartel leadership with lethal force, all of it matters right now, in this specific window of time. Because the cartels are watching, they have always been watching. And what they see coming out of Washington today is something they haven't seen in a long time. A president who makes a threat, and then follows through. In a world where the unwritten rule between American tourists and Mexican cartels has held for decades on the basis of calculated fear, the question is not whether that fear still exists. The question is whether it's enough.